Hello, and welcome to our first lecture. So once again, I emphasize this is all brand new for all of us, especially me. So please be patient as I make mistakes. I surely will. But I'm sure we'll be all right as we go along, and I will hopefully improve as we go along. So in today's lecture, we're going to cover Chapter 1. And if you have your lecture objective set questions in front of you, then the questions we're going to cover in today's lecture are these first 5 questions. So we're going to look at the term anatomy, physiology, talk about a little bit about this idea of form follows function, and we're going to talk about the 7 levels of structural organization, and the 7 characteristics that describe life. The second lecture that we'll have will finish the rest of the objective set questions, and this is where we get into talking about homeostasis. So that's going to be the second presentation of this lecture series for Chapter 1. So let's begin, and let's begin with the definition or the description of our course. So this is, as you know, this is Biology 40A. And we're going to look at human anatomy and physiology. Human anatomy and physiology. So, if we're studying anatomy and physiology, we should probably understand those 2 terms. What does anatomy really mean, and what does physiology really mean? I would guess that at this point you have some idea, but let's begin with the breaking down of the word itself. So if we look at anatomy, this is actually composed of 2 parts, this term and this term. So anan, if you look it up, its root, I believe it's Latin, is up, and this means to cut. So to cut up, that is the literal interpretation or the literal meaning of this word. But what we're really talking about in this course is the structure of the human body. Okay. The architecture, if you will, of the human body. The structure, how it's put together, what is it? What do they look like? And in particular, also their relationship to each other. That is the relationship of structures within the human body. How is the heart related to the lungs? How is it related to the vessels, the blood vessels that are connected to it, and so forth and so on. So here in anatomy, that part of our study is we're simply looking at how your body is put together, all the different parts, how they relate to each other. The second term is physiology. And again, we can break this word part into its 2 parts. Physio, which means nature, and ology, which means the study of. So literally what that word means is it is the study of nature. But in our case, what we're really talking about is its function. Okay? How does it work? We look at the structures and then we ask ourselves, how do they work? So this brings us to a saying or a phrase that captures both of these ideas in one related idea. So let's talk about that and come back then to anatomy and physiology as we look at that particular idea. So the idea that I'm talking about is this: form follows function. So how something looks how it's built is connected to how it works. Okay. So when we look at something, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and all the structures that we find inside there, each of those organs, we see a particular form, how it's put together, its architecture. But that architecture is not just sitting there disconnected from any other idea. It is very closely connected to how the thing works. So how it works is connected, or how it looks, how it's built, is connected to how it works. So this is a very powerful idea. And it's something that we will be looking at as we go through this course. And of course, it's going to be something that you're going to be keeping track of as you go through 40B and 40C. Very powerful idea, but there are some other things that we have to consider when we talk about form follows function. So it's not always as simple as the idea that I just expressed. In other words, there are other processes, other forces that are at work here in your body. So this idea is molded by a couple of outside forces, if you will. Number one, the physical laws okay. So what we're talking about here are the laws of physics. Okay. So things like the gas laws, gravity, all of these things are going to have an effect on how it not only looks, but how it functions. So yes, form follows functions, but it has to operate in this environment where it has to obey these physical laws of the universe. Okay. So you can't break the laws of physics when you build a living human structure. Another aspect of this is the environment. Okay. So here, what we're talking about is when a living organism grows, what kind of environment does it grow up in? What effect did the environment have on the growth and development of an organism? For example, there could be a lack of food when a human grew up. So you may have, for example, the genes that if you had plenty of food when you were growing up would get you to a height of, say, 6 feet 4 inches tall. But if you didn't have the necessary nutrients and energy while you were growing, then you wouldn't reach that height. So lack of food, sickness, and disease, all of these things can have an impact on not only how you function, but how you look as well. So this idea of form follows function is going to be modified and molded and be subject to the physical laws and the environment in which that organism grew up in or developed in. And the third factor that we have to keep in consideration is our evolutionary past. Okay. And one thing to keep in mind is that nature cannot produce new structures from scrap. It must modify existing structures to meet new challenges. Okay. And so new structures will lose their purpose as new conditions arise, because through evolutionary processes, which we're not going to get into in this class, this is what happens. Nature is going to modify existing structures to address the pressures and the forces that are acting on the populations of living organisms. So, for example, nature is not going to invent a pair of wings out of nothing. It has to take pre-existing structures and modify them to create what we call wings with, for example, birds. And of course, this has happened several times. Birds have wings, bats have wings. They both are doing the same function, but because they were modified from different pre-existing structures, they are, even though they carry on the same function, they are structurally different. So this also plays a role in what we're going to study in the human body, and I'll give you a good example of that. So in the human body, there are muscles, smooth muscles, in fact, that are connected to the hairs of your body. So if you're looking at a typical hair, so this is the surface of the skin, this is the hair, and there is a set of muscles that are connected here, and these are called the pili muscles. And when they are engaged, what happens is this hair will stand on end. And so what you'll see if you engage these muscles is the hair will stand directly up. Okay? Because the muscle has contracted, that is connected here. So this muscle has contracted. And what that does is it pushes the skin up on this side, because the hair moved in this way, this direction, it pushed the skin up, and that's what we call a goosebump. So what is the purpose here? Why do we have goosebumps? What is the purpose of that structure? And it turns out there is no purpose. But when we had fur in our evolutionary past, if we were able to lift the hair of our fur, we could do two things with that. We could create a larger insulating layer, so when we were cold, we could that would help keep our body warmth. And the second function that it performed was that in threat displays we look bigger. So you have seen cats and dogs when they get stressed and when they feel that they're threatened, the hairs on their back stand up. Okay, so this makes them look bigger to whatever is threatening them. But of course, we lost our hair for good reason. And this function that still exists in our body now has lost its purpose, because we don't have enough hair for that to be a significant factor in our biology and our physiology. So form follows function, but it's modified by these three things: the physical laws, the environment, and our evolutionary past. Okay, so let's turn to how we're going to study. this very complex thing that we call the human body. So one of the ways that scientists deal with very complex problems is they break them down into their smaller parts. And they understand the smaller parts thoroughly. It's an easier problem to solve. They put it back together and they can see the big picture. So one of the ways that we will do this in this class is by breaking it down, and our chapters do this, as you'll see. So some of the things that I'm going to list here are going to be related to the chapters that we're going to look at. When we do this in our human body, we can kind of break down the human body into levels or structural levels of organization. So that's what we're going to look at now. Levels of structural organization. And your textbook has a very good image of this. I'm going to modify it slightly, but let's go ahead and look at that image and talk about it. And so here is the image I'm referring to right here. So we have, in this image, and as I said, I'm going to modify this slightly. So we start at a chemical level of organization. We have one whole chapter devoted to this. This is the second chapter that we look at, the chemistry of the human body. And then they jump to the cellular level here. I'm going to insert another level right here, which would make that 7 rather than 6 that they talk about here. And I'll talk about that. And these are organelles. So that we'll get that to our notes in just a second. Then the cellular level, and this is chapter 2. So this is a way of understanding the body. We're breaking it down into this this simpler level on a cellular level. And then from there, the next chapter is on tissues. So that's the next most complicated level of the body. And then from then, we're going to be looking at organ systems. And so when we look at an organ system, we'll start looking at the organs, how they're put together, what they look like, and then how they relate to each other. And by doing that, we will understand the entire human body. So it's this process of taking a very complex problem, breaking it down to its more simpler parts, understanding those, and then putting it all back together again. So let's go ahead and go through those structural levels. And as you saw, the first level is the chemical level. So the chemical level of organization. And so what we're talking about here are the elements, the atoms and molecules that we are composed of. And if we look at the basic level, which is the atoms, we will be looking at the elements, and very quickly we'll just identify some of the major elements we're composed of. So we're composed of carbon, and carbon actually represents about 18.5% of our total body mass. So our total body mass. So that's carbon. Another one is hydrogen. And this represents about 9.5% of our total body mass. And then we can talk about oxygen. And this represents a whopping 65.0% of our total body mass. Oxygen represents 65% of our total body mass. Now, when we get into this chapter, we're going to be looking at the four the four macromolecules that make up the human body, and that would be carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep this list in mind as we go through. We're going to add a couple more, and we're going to keep these numbers in mind and see how did we get to 65% here. Carbon, which you would think would be the largest, is only representing 18%. So that's an interesting thing to keep track of, and we'll talk about that once we get into that chapter and look at the chemicals that make up the human body. But let's continue. So we have oxygen, and of course you probably have already thought of this, nitrogen. And this represents about 3.2% of our total body mass. And then we have, I'm going to add one more. So these first four are obviously the major part of what we're composed of: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And nitrogen. Those are the major constituents, the major elements that we are composed of. But if we want to go down one more, the next major component, believe it or not, is calcium. And this represents 1.5%. So it really drops off now. And of course, we could go through at a complete list, and the numbers would get smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay? So the chemical level of organization. Now, the next level, which would be number 2, and this is the one that I'm adding. So this is not present in the image that we looked at earlier. So you notice that we went from the atoms and molecules directly to the cells. And I'm introducing another level in between, which we'll look at when we get into the chapter on cells. And that's the organelles. Okay. These organelles are subcellular structures within cells that have special functions. Let me give you some examples. Mitochondria. So mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, and they produce ATP. That's one example. Another example would be the nucleus. This contains the genetic material. And we'll look at a number of these when we get into that chapter. So this is organelles. And now the next level is the cellular level. And the cellular level of organism is, interestingly, this is where life begins. So up until we reach this complexity and organization, the thing that we call life, and we'll talk about what exactly that is in just a bit, cannot exist because there's not the structural complexity to support that emergent property that we call life. That property that we call life can only exist at a certain level of complexity. And it's at the cellular level that we reach that level of complexity so that life begins at this particular stage of organization or level of organization. And obviously there are many kinds of life, and we'll be looking at only one type in this class, which is you, the human body, or the human being. The next level of organization is tissues. All right. So we're going to define tissues as a group of similar cells working together to perform a particular function. Okay. And this is where we really begin to get into some interesting physiology. So the levels that we talked about previously, we'll have to understand. We'll address them at different points as you go forward, not just in this class, but in 40B and 40C. But this level here, the tissues level, that's a level at which you really need to have a deep understanding of, because the rest of this course and the rest of 40B and 40C, you won't be able to understand what's happening unless you understand tissues. So this is a very critical chapter. And I will spend some time here, both in the lab and in the lecture, talking about tissues, what they are, how they're put together, how they function, and so forth and so on. So this is really where we really begin to get into some meaty, if you will, some very interesting physiology, and where basically the physiology of the human body really takes place is at a tissue level. Okay? So what are tissues? Well, I've defined them, but that doesn't really give you a sense of what they are. There are 4 basic types of tissues in the human body. So there are 4 basic types of tissues. Number 1 is epithelial tissue. Number 2 is muscle tissue. Number 3 is connective tissue. And number 4 is nervous tissue. So those are the 4 basic types of tissues. We'll be looking at them. And of course, each one of those 4 basic types can be subdivided into a variety of different types. So you can have a variety of different types of epithelial tissue. If we look at muscle tissue, there are 3 basic types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And each one of those is slightly different from the other and performs different functions. Okay? The same is true with connective tissue and also, to a certain extent, nervous tissue. So those are the 4 basic types of tissues, and that's the 4th level of organization. The next level is organs. Okay. So the definition of an organ, then, is it is 2 or more tissue types that combine together to form structures with specific functions and usually recognizable shapes. And a classic example would be the heart. So the heart is composed of nervous tissue, it's composed of muscle tissue, it's composed of connective tissue, and it's composed of epithelial tissue, and it forms a specific function. It pumps blood through the body, and it has a recognizable shape. So that's an organ. The next level of organization is the organ system. So the organ system now is where we put together, let's make that a definition, is several related organs with a common function. And keeping in line with the example of the organ, the heart, so if we look at the cardiovascular system, it includes one organ, the heart, which is the pump. It includes another set of organs, which are the blood vessels, the arteries, the veins, the arterioles, the venules, the capillaries. And then a third component of that is the actual blood plasma, the cells that make up that are dissolved or found in the blood plasma. So that's an organ system. The same can be true of the respiratory system, or any other system that you can think of. It's composed of organs that are related to each other and perform a common function. Okay. Now this is the next level, of course, is then the human being. Okay. For our example, it's the entire organism. In our case, as I said, it's the human being, obviously. And we're going to stop here. So we're breaking down the human into these structural levels in order to understand how the human being works, how it functions, how it's put together. If this were a different class, we could go on. We could talk about populations. We could talk about communities. We could talk about ecosystems. But this class is not dealing with that. So we stop at this, the organ system. But the next level up is, of course, the human. So coming back and looking at our image, we talked about chemical levels of organization. We talked about organelles, cellular level, the tissue level, organs, and then organ systems. Here where they're showing us the digestive tract, and then finally the organism itself. Okay. All right. So we've been talking about, and we finally got to the point when we were looking at structural organization. We talked about life emerging at the level of cells. So if this is a class about a living thing, if I'm a biologist, I should be able to tell you the definition of life. And I'm here to tell you that I can't. So we really don't have a good definition of life. We don't really understand that property that we call life. I mean, we understand it on a lot of different levels. We've broken it down. We've looked at, we have a lot of information on the molecular structures of life and how they interact and all these different levels. A huge ton of information and research that has gone into breaking down this idea of life, or this thing that we call life, and trying to understand it. But in the end, we really don't have a good definition of what life is. What we do have is a list of characteristics that, as far as we know so far, all life shares. So it's a laundry list of what life is, but it's not really a description of life itself. It's simply a list of characteristics that, when we look at the world around us, life shares these characteristics. So let's go through and just list these characteristics and let it go at that. And I'm going to suggest that maybe this class is not the right class to ask that question, what is life? Maybe the best course for you to take if you want to answer that question is a class in philosophy or even religion. Okay, so what is life? That's what we're asking ourselves. And what we're going to do is we're going to identify the characteristics of life. Okay? And the first characteristic is going to be metabolism. Okay. And we're going to define metabolism as the sum of all chemical reactions that occur in the body. The sum of all chemical reactions that occur in the body. And there are a lot of them. And so if we apply this idea of taking a very large, complex problem and breaking it down into its smaller parts, the first step in this idea of metabolism would be to look at all those reactions and see if we can start categorizing them into some organization that makes sense. And we can do that. But we're not going to get into the weeds of this, but I will give you the two basic major categories. And we're going to break these down into two types of reactions. And the first one is going to be catabolism. And this is where we're going to break down large molecules into smaller molecules. And usually we'll get energy out of that reaction. Okay. So this is what happens during digestion. You eat your Big Mac, your order of fries, your chocolate milkshake. It gets into the digestive system. And all of that is composed of very large molecules, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and so forth. And your digestive system will begin the process of breaking down those larger molecules into smaller molecules. So you'll break down carbohydrates into sugars, simple sugars like glucose. You'll break down proteins into amino acids. All of those reactions that take the very large molecules and break them down into smaller molecules are organized under this idea of catabolism. Okay. The second major category of chemical reactions that happen in our body is anabolism. Okay. And this is where we take small molecules and make larger molecules. This requires energy. So one of the things that happens in your body is you go through catabolic reactions, which are going to release energy. And then you take that energy and you take the small molecules, which you've been so hard breaking down, and you build larger molecules out of them, which are you. So it seems weird. You take a large molecule, you break it down, take it into your body, and then you take the pieces and you build the large molecule again. The thing to keep in mind is that when you eat a Big Mac, when you eat a hamburger, those large molecules that food is composed of are not the large molecules that you necessarily need. That's one problem. The second problem is in order to get that material, in order to get those elements, in order to get those atoms, those molecules into your body, they have to be small. You can't take a hamburger and stuff it across the wall of the gut. You're going to have to take that hamburger and break it down into its smaller parts, and then you have things small enough to move across the wall. Then what you do with those small pieces is you build it up, and you build the proteins, you build the carbohydrates, you build the lipids that you are composed of. And to do that requires energy. You got the energy when you broke the molecules down. We'll talk about that process. Take that energy, take those small molecules, and build them up to create you. Okay? So that's the first characteristic of life, is metabolism. A second characteristic of life is responsiveness. Okay. That is the ability to respond to external and internal changes in the environment. Okay? The ability to respond to changes, whether they're external changes or internal changes. So you're sitting in the sun, you're warming up. How does your body respond to that? You move, you take off your sweater, you sweat. There's a number of different responses that are possible. Internal changes. You're eating food. You're eating a lot of sweets, let's say. The amount of sugar that you're taking into your body is climbing and climbing and climbing, getting larger and larger and larger. And you have to respond to the increase in glucose in the blood. That's changing to an internal condition. Okay? So responsiveness, that ability to respond to changes in external conditions and internal conditions, that is all involved with responsiveness. Now we're going to connect this idea very closely with another idea called homeostasis. So just keep that in mind. If you, as a living organism, cannot detect changes that are going on, whether they're external or internal, you will not be able to maintain homeostasis. You will not be able to maintain the conditions that you need to survive and to live. So this is a very important property, the ability to respond to changes. Okay. The third characteristic is movement. Okay. Whether this movement is as an organism, okay. So you walk outside, go to the grocery stores, all of that is part of movement, but also on a cellular level. If you look at your body cells, there's constant movement. There's movement within your body. Blood is traveling to the arteries and veins of your body. Okay? So that's another characteristic of life. A fourth characteristic is growth. Okay? So growth can be defined as an increase in size. You can increase your size by, number one, increasing the number of cells. That's one way for you to create growth. You can increase the stuff, and this is a very scientific term, stuff, between cells, on the outside of cells. Or you can increase or grow by increasing the size of cells. So all of these mechanisms are possible to fulfill this characteristic that we identify as growth. Okay? The next step, or the next level, or the next characteristic, is what we call differentiation. Oh, forgot that I. So here we're talking about the development of a cell from an unspecialized cell often referred to as a stem cell, at least in the human body, okay, to a specialized cell. Okay. So differentiation, the development of a cell from a unspecialized to a specialized cell. Let me give you a really good example of this in your own body. So your blood is composed of 3 different types of cells: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. If we take a look at the development of these, we start from a stem cell. That stem cell can differentiate into red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. That's a process of differentiation. So you're going from unspecialized to specialized. From unspecialized to specialized. All of these are specialized. They all come from that unspecialized cell. This is a process of differentiation. And all life shows this characteristic to one degree or another. Another example of this idea of differentiation is your own development. So you can go from a zygote, and a zygote is the fertilized human egg. So when the sperm fertilizes the egg, we call that a zygote. Okay. You go from a zygote to the adult human. Okay. That's a process of differentiation. You're going from a single cell to an adult. You grow the human, it's born, it goes through the baby stage, the infant stage, the pre-teen stage, the teen stage, and so forth and so on until you get to a senior human being. Okay. So that's differentiation. A 6th characteristic is reproduction. Reproduction comes in basically 2 forms. Number 1, you can produce new cells for growth, repair, and replacement. Okay. Or the production of a new human. That's obviously another way in which reproduction is manifest. Right. So these are all characteristics of life. And I'm going to add one more. This is the 7th. Your textbook does not talk about this, but I want to add it to emphasize this, and that's evolution. So all life evolves. Individuals may not evolve. So you're born with a set of genes, and you're going to have those same set of genes when you die. But a population of living organisms evolve. And what we're talking about here is a change of alleles over time. Now, an allele is a particular form of a gene. So it's a change in a number of certain types of genes in a population over time. And all populations experience this process. So it is part of life. It's one of the characteristics of life. That is evolutionary change over time. Okay. So that ends this lecture. The next lecture that we are going to see, by the way, let's recap what we covered. So in this lecture, we covered the definition of anatomy. We talked about physiology, what that means. We talked about this, form follows function. We talked about the 7 levels of structural organization. And why is that important? Because that's a way that we can take this very complex thing we call a human being, break it down into simpler concepts and simpler parts, understand that simpler idea or part, put it back together to understand the whole. And then we also talked about the 7 characteristics of life. Okay. The next lecture that I will deliver will be on basically this idea, homeostasis, and we'll talk about what that means, and in that process we'll be talking about the adult human body, fluid compartments, and so forth and so on. There's a number of handouts. Those are listed in my Canvas shell. They're all clearly identified, and there are links. I would ask you to print those out and have them in front of you when you open up the next lecture. So thank you very much, and I will see you next time.